Mr. Cooper, the floor is yours.
We haven't, okay.
The floor.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And here we have a situation where members of Parliament, 19 of them were, and senators, 19 parliamentarians, not including members of Parliament and senators, were the target of a cyber attack by the Beijing-directed, Beijing-controlled ATP 31. Those members of Parliament were kept in the dark for 3 years by this government. This government knew about the ATP 31 attack when it happened in January of 2021. And notwithstanding that, there were no efforts made to inform members of Parliament that they were the target of the Beijing regime, no efforts to inform them so that they could take appropriate steps to protect themselves. Indeed, these members of Parliament and senators would have had no idea that they were the target of the Beijing regime but for an indictment out of the Department of Justice in the U.S. And it was only then that they became aware of the fact that they were the target. And that led to the finding of the Speaker of a prima facie question of privilege, which has now been referred to this committee. And I would note that while members of Parliament were kept in the dark, CSIS and the CSE and the Prime Minister's office and the Privy Council office, the Prime Minister's own department, and multiple departments within this government had received briefings about the ATP 31 attack. And so, very simply put, there was a complete breakdown in notifying MPs. But this is part of a pattern because this has happened before. We know that this government was aware that sitting members of Parliament, including MP Michael Chong, were the target of the Beijing regime, and yet he was kept in the dark, resulting in a finding of the Speaker of a prima facie question of privilege, which came before this committee and which we studied. And so what we have is a government that has been less than transparent, that has failed to provide transparency and sunlight, and frankly has, at times, outright covered up and turned a blind eye to Beijing's interference. We have, in this case, or not in this case, but following what happened in the case of MP Chong, the Minister of Public Safety in May of 2023 issued a directive requiring CSIS to brief MPs if they are the target of foreign interference. It is interesting that following the issuance of that order, there was a briefing of multiple government departments, including the Prime Minister's department, the PCO, about this ATP 31 attack, and notwithstanding the order of the House, those departments were briefed, but the sitting members of Parliament continued to be left in the dark. It raises questions about the effectiveness of this order and whether this directive is in fact being followed, because it doesn't appear to be something that is being followed by this government.
Point of order,
it seems
Chair.
to be.
Mr. Turnbull, on a
Mr.
point of
Cooper
order.
talks about dwelling in the dark. That's what his Conservative leader is doing by not getting a security clearance. Can he maybe answer why his leader, who we know that the Conservative leadership race included
Mr. Turnbull.
the People's Republic of China interfering in it, why he won't get a security clearance?
Thank you, Mr. Turnbull. We're getting into debate there. I think you're a seasoned parliamentarian, so make sure that points of order are focused on legitimate points of order. Mr. Cooper, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I'd be happy to address the point raised by Mr. Turnbull. And to that end, the Leader of the Opposition has been very clear. He'll take the same brief that the Washington Post received. He'll take the same briefing that the Prime Minister has received. But what he will not do is allow the Prime Minister to get this clearance, and then allow the Prime Minister to pick and choose which information is put before him, which may in fact be incomplete, which may not present the full picture, and then allow the Prime Minister to be an arbiter of whether he violated his oath of secrecy. The Leader of the Opposition isn't going to play the Prime Minister's game. If the Prime Minister was serious, he would release the names of all of the MPs who have wittingly collaborated with the Beijing regime, but he won't do that because we know that they sit in his caucus. And we know that the Prime Minister covered up the fact that one of his candidates, the now member for Don Valley North, received the assistance of the Beijing regime to help him secure the Liberal Party nomination. CSIS was aware of Beijing's interference at the time of the nomination. CSIS briefed key officials, top Liberals, including Jeremy Broadhurst, as well as the president of the Liberal Party of Canada. Four top Liberals, all of whom had the appropriate security clearance to receive that briefing, to inform them that, yes, the member for Don Valley North, the then Liberal candidate, had been assisted by the Beijing regime. Jeremy Broadhurst thought it was serious enough that he briefed the Prime Minister the following day about that briefing. The Prime Minister, having been made aware that one of his candidates was being assisted by the Beijing regime, did nothing. He turned a blind eye to it, he covered it up, and allowed that individual to stand for office and get elected, and hoped that no one would find out. Madam Justice Hogue, in her report, concluded that the Prime Minister's inaction with respect to the now member for Don Valley North, who he had been briefed on, his failure to take action was due to his primary concern for his political concern. That is paraphrasing what Madam Justice concluded, that it was out of political motivation that the Prime Minister didn't act. And so there you have it. Madam Justice Hogue, the Commissioner of the Public Inquiry, who found that the Prime Minister put his political interests and the interests of the Liberal Party ahead of national security and ahead of countering Beijing's interference in our democratic processes. That's the record of this Prime Minister. It's also, by the way, with respect to the member for Don Valley North and security briefings, very interesting that the member was then tipped off that he was a target of CSIS. Now, that raises questions about who tipped him off. We know that 4 top Liberals received the briefing from CSIS, and we know that the Prime Minister was informed by Mr. Broadhurst about the contents of that briefing. And so the circle is actually quite small as to who may have tipped the member for Don Valley North off that he was a target of CSIS.
Oui, Madame Fortier.
Point of order, Madam Fortier. I understand that my colleague needs to speak at length on his motion, but I would like to remind him that on the agenda, we also have, we had witnesses, and they are wanting to talk about election reform, and they'd like to share their opinions with us. So perhaps if our colleague would like to pause for a moment and let us work for the next 45 minutes to try to at least hear from these witnesses for panel 2. If he chooses not to, well, he'll continue. But we did have an agenda, and I think if he's going to continue proving his point, thank you, Madame Fortier. It's
right, Madame Fortier, to share your viewpoint. However, Mr. Cooper has the floor, and it's up to Mr. Cooper to determine what he would like to, what he'd like to do with the floor. Mr. Cooper, the floor is yours.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And the member for Don Valley North had been tipped off, and there were...
Point of order, Chair.
Yes, Mr. Turnbull.
Mr. Cooper's intervention isn't even relevant to the motion that he's put on notice. It has nothing to do with the cyber attack that's in question in his motion. So I'm not sure what he's speaking to, but it's not relevant to the actual question of privilege that we've been debating.
So colleagues, here's what I'm going to do. Because it's worked in the past, so let's see if it works again. I'm going to suspend here briefly with the hope that the parties can come together and decide how we want to use the next 45 minutes or so of time. We do still have our witnesses present that have taken time out of their busy schedules to speak to us on a very important matter. That window is closing rapidly that we have to hear from them. So I'm going to suspend to ask the parties to negotiate some type of solution to the stalemate that we appear to be at right now. And then I will come back once I have an understanding of where that may go. Ms. Matheson?
If I may just ask a question, is there a possibility of extending or having more resources on an extension of time so that we do hear from the witnesses, if that's the choice to be made, considering...
Unfortunately, Ms. Matheson, no, we don't have the resources, so that's why it's particularly important that the committee members determine how they want the next 40 minutes or so to go. So based on what I just said, I'm going to suspend. We are going to... resume our proceedings here. Mr. Cooper, you had the floor, and I'll turn the floor back over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And as I was stating before we suspended, that 5 Liberals, including the Prime Minister, had received directly or indirectly a briefing that the member for Don Valley North was assisted by the Beijing regime to help him secure his nomination. That member was tipped off by a top Liberal. Who is it? Was it Jeremy Broadhurst? Was it the Prime Minister himself? Which of these, was it Ismail, the President of the Liberal Party? Did he tip off the member for Don Valley North? It is a question that needs to be answered. Because
Point of order, Chair.
Mr. Turnbull, on a point of order.
We at least apologize to the witnesses for the Conservatives' attempt to filibuster their own motion here, and just say we're really sorry to the witnesses for having spent their time coming here to testify and then be totally disrespected in terms of their time.
So colleagues, a couple of things. The first is I will take the opportunity, Mr. Turnbull, given the point that you raised, simply to let the witnesses know, as I believe the clerk has informed them of already. Unfortunately, we will not have the opportunity today to hear from them. I'm not going to offer my opinion subjectively as to why that is, but simply I'm sorry that we haven't had the opportunity to get to you. I do ask to colleagues and anyone in the room, we are in the middle of a proceeding, so if conversations can be taken outside, I would appreciate that. But again, we are moving forward with the proceeding as is, which will return the floor to Mr. Cooper.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I think what's disrespectful is a government that continues to defy an order of this committee to turn over documents 3 months after the deadline has passed. I think that is disrespectful. I think what's disrespectful is a government that has failed to produce documents ordered by the House related to the Green Slush Fund, and to not only fail to turn over those documents involving a massive scandal involving the misuse of $400 million taxpayer dollars, but for the government House leader to go out on CBC and lie to Canadians, as she did yesterday, that the government was in compliance, when we heard today from the law clerk that no, in fact, the government is not in compliance with the order of the House. And I'll tell you what is not only disrespectful, but quite a bit worse, is the Prime Minister, who was briefed that one of his candidates had been assisted by the Beijing regime, and the fact that he turned a blind eye to it, allowed that candidate to stand, kept the voters and Canadians in the dark. It speaks to a Prime Minister who then turns around and lectures the Leader of the Opposition about foreign interference, when he's the one who's compromised and turned a blind eye to foreign interference.
Chair, could I do a point of order, please?
It never ceases to amaze me.
Mr. Cooper, I do have a point of order.
No,
of course, Mr. Turnbull, at any point a member does have the right. However, the chair needs to determine whether or not there's relevance on that point of order. But I can't determine that, of course, until I hear what the point of order is.
I know Mr. Cooper's got his little misinformation propellers going pretty quickly, but maybe he could explain why PRC officials allegedly interfered in the leadership races of the Conservative Party of Canada while he's pontificating.
Colleagues. Okay, that's a nice volume level. Mr. Turnbull, that is not, unfortunately, a relevant point of order. You are veering into debate. With that, Mr. Cooper, I return the floor to you.
You know, with the Prime Minister, it's projection all the time. Everything.
Point of order again, Chair. Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Cooper. But
Mr.
point
Turnbull,
of order on relevance, Chair, and relevance is definitely a point of order that's in the Green Manual.
Explain.
Mr. Cooper is speaking to a number of other instances that he's speculating about that have nothing to do with his notice of motion. So the motion that he's moved says that in relation to its order of reference of Thursday, May 9th, 2024, regarding the prima facie contempt concerning the People's Republic of China's cyber attack against members of Parliament. So it refers specifically to a cyber attack. Mr. Cooper is not speaking about a cyber attack. He's speaking of other instances of potential foreign interference that he is citing. It has nothing to do with the cyber attack. So how is this relevant at all? It seems clear that Mr. Cooper's intention here is to waste the committee's time, valuable time that witnesses were asked to come to this committee to answer questions on another matter, and he's now just wasting the committee's time. So with irrelevant arguments.
Sure.
Point of order.
Okay. Thank you for your insight, Mr. Turnbull. I will keep my ear open to whether or not I believe the speaker is remaining relevant to the motion at hand, which is what we are debating. Mr. Cooper, the floor is yours.
Appel au règlement, Monsieur le Président.
Oui, Monsieur Berthold.
Monsieur le Président, je voulais juste mentionner à mon...
Chair, he only read a part of that motion. He could read it completely. Perhaps we'll see. Oh, Mr. Berthold, I know that you want to give yourself a break for your colleague, but if we determine that it's not an acceptable point of order, we're going to do the same for your point of order. Mr. Cooper, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I've got to say that when it comes to trusting this Prime Minister to be straight with Canadians about foreign interference and what he knows and so on, I would submit that he has a track record of not being trusted when he covers things up, when he doesn't come forward and be truthful, when he denies things until he's caught, when he appoints his former ski buddy, David Johnson, as his fake rapporteur, and then selectively gave that fake rapporteur only certain documents to look at about Beijing's interference so that he could get a predetermined outcome to his report, a report that was ultimately torn to shreds. It's no wonder that the Leader of the Opposition isn't going to say to this Prime Minister, who is a proven liar,
Point of order.
I'm going to trust you to
Point of order,
present.
Chair.
Yeah.
That directly violated the standing order rules on decorum. Calling another member of Parliament a liar is in direct contravention of our code of conduct here and our rules of decorum. Chair, I would ask that Mr. Cooper withdraw that. If you could ask him, I would appreciate it.
Mr. Cooper, I do believe Mr. Turnbull is correct in his interpretation of the use of parliamentary language. So if we could just ask you, colleagues, I know moments of levity are important, but at the same time, I think for those that have stomached our discussion today, they probably do want us to get on with the business. But to Mr. Turnbull's point, Mr. Cooper, if I could ask you to, please withdraw the previous comment, which as a seasoned parliamentarian you know very well is unparliamentary language. And B, if you could please try to refrain from doing that in the future, I would gladly return the floor to you and hope that we can continue with the discussion you would like to have.
Well, withdraw, Mr. Chair, and I will rephrase to say that the Prime Minister has a proven record of misrepresenting the facts. And so no wonder the Leader of the Opposition isn't going to trust this Prime Minister to say, I'm going to give you what I want you to look at and maybe hide other things from you and give you an incomplete picture of things. But that's what the Prime Minister is proposing, and the Leader of the Opposition isn't going to take the Prime Minister's bait. He's not going to play the Prime Minister's game. The Leader of the Opposition has instead called on the Prime Minister to simply release the names of all compromised MPs, and the Prime Minister continues to refuse to do so, just as he covered up for the member for Don Valley North. So, no, the Leader of the Opposition will not take lessons, and Conservatives will not take lessons from this Prime Minister and from this government when it comes to foreign interference, because the record of this government is a shocking one in this regard, and it's drawn actually concern amongst our allies.
International condemnation.
International condemnation of the Prime Minister, and it's been said we have the Five Eyes. It's after 9 years of this Prime Minister, it's become increasingly the Four Eyes, where Canada has been left out, including, look at AUKUS as an example, where our allies shut Canada out. And there are other instances, but that's what happens when you have a Prime Minister who has gone along with Beijing far too often and allowed Beijing to interfere in 2 elections, who turned a blind eye to the fact that one of his own members was compromised and he knew about it. The fact that Beijing has set up illegal police stations targeting Chinese Canadians. That's what has happened after 9 years of this Prime Minister. And with respect to the motion before us and the cyber attack on 19 members of Parliament, this is something that should concern all members of Parliament, because it was members in all political parties that were targeted and who were kept in the dark, who wouldn't have known but for an unsealed indictment from the U.S. Department of Justice that led to the ruling of the Speaker of the prima facie question of privilege, and this committee to undertake the study of the question of privilege. And we have had hearings, and we were at a point where we were about to look to conclude this study until we discovered that there are a number of reasons why this study ought not to be concluded at this present time. And one is that this committee had ordered that this government produce documents and produce them by August the 9th. We received...
Point of order?
Yes.
Yeah, Mr. Duncan, on a point of order.
Thank you, Mr. I'll make sure mine's certainly relevant. So thank you, Mr. Chair, for recognizing me. I just want to have on the record for you, Mr. Chair, I'm not sure when you may try to move adjournment, but we do not consent to adjournment. So I just want to put that on the record now.
It's not a point of order.
Knowing it's quarter-to, but just note for that.
It is not a point of order. Perhaps, Mr. Duncan, if you do want to raise or draw my attention and the committee's attention to that, there'll be an appropriate time to do so. Mr. Cooper.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And this committee ordered the government to turn over all documents in its control in relation to the cyber attack against these 19 parliamentarians. And the deadline was August the 9th. Prior to August the 9th, we received a batch of documents, primarily from the CSE, a few from CSIS, I believe, and they were heavily redacted, but nonetheless, there was information that was not redacted that raised further questions, including documents referring to or suggesting a cyber attack in October of 2022. That had not been made known to this committee. It's unclear what that cyber attack is in relation to, but I have it here under the CSIS Issues Management Brief from 2022, and it states it was sent to the Deputy Minister of Public Safety, the Minister of Public Safety, as well as NSIA, Minister of Public Safety, Chief of Staff. And the issue is it says CSIS intends to meet with select MPs and or their staff regarding cyber targeting of parliamentarians by People's Republic of China cyber actors. Background. In October 2022, CSIS became aware of an email campaign targeting the personal email addresses of parliamentarians and staff, along with other Government of Canada targets with malicious phishing emails. This campaign was likely conducted by PRC state-affiliated cyber actors. So, there we have, in the production from CSIS, reference to a cyber attack targeting, or seemingly to target, MPs, because CSIS was indicating that they intended to brief those MPs. And so there are questions about, is the ATP 31 cyber attack the only cyber attack that CSIS is aware of, specifically targeting MPs by the PRC or by other hostile foreign states? So we need to get clarification about that. And if, in fact, the ATP 31 attack is not the only cyber attack that CSIS and the CSE are aware of, then it raises questions about how many other attacks have there been, the nature of them, when they occurred, who directed them, and whether parliamentarians that were the target, were the victims, have been briefed. Because we know in the case of the ATP 31 attack, members were kept in the dark and would have continued to have been kept in the dark but for the unsealed indictment from the U.S. Department of Justice that was released in March of this year. And so it was on that basis that this committee, at the insistence of Conservatives, but I believe ultimately a unanimous vote of this committee, called on the CSE and CSIS to come back to committee. And the response from CSIS and the CSE was to thumb their nose at this committee. They said, no thank you, we're not interested in coming back before this committee. They thumbed their nose at this committee, at Parliament, at parliamentary scrutiny. And the justification that was offered was that they had come in June. Yes, they did come in June, and they provided some, it was useful to have them here before this committee. But there are documents that were provided to this committee in the summer that raise questions that need to be put to them and that we need to get answers to in order to complete this study in a fulsome fashion. And I cited some of the questions that need to be asked in relation to the documents that CSE and CSIS did produce. I would have thought that could, based on the limited documents, relatively limited number of documents that had been provided over the summer, that could have been done in one sitting, where we had CSIS and the CSE appear before this committee. And there seemed to be some level of recognition from all members of the committee about the need to hear from CSIS and CSE, and a view that they could come here and we could ask them questions and then see at that point whether we would be in a position to essentially wrap up the study. But now we find out, or we found out, I guess on Friday, that there has been a massive document dump from CSIS and the CSE. I haven't had a chance to go through those documents. Remember that CSIS and the CSE, this government, were required to turn over the documents by August 9th. And somehow, more than 3 months later, we have a document dump. And then, when I asked Madam Clerk whether there were any further documents that are to be turned over from CSIS and the CSE, she said there was and I'm paraphrasing her, I'm not quoting her directly, but a large volume of documents that still haven't been produced to this committee. And not only have they not been produced, we don't even have a timeline as to when the CSE and CSIS will be producing those documents and making them available to this committee, even though the only deadline that matters is the August 9th deadline, a deadline that this government has defied and has seemingly no interest in abiding by. A document dump on Friday, a voluminous number of other outstanding documents that they say they'll turn over whenever they feel like it because they can't even provide a timeline. And the Liberal members across the way are confused as to why this motion has been brought forward. I mean, I think it's quite astounding that this committee, certain members of this committee, would be prepared to wrap up the study without having the opportunity to question CSIS and the CSE about the documents that they have produced, which raise new questions, and about their failure to produce other documents and to have the ability to question them about whatever is contained in the document dump that came more than 3 months after they were ordered to produce the documents. I think it's pretty reasonable. In fact, it's the only responsible thing to do is to say, hold on, let's look at the documents, let's get all the documents, let's bring in CSIS and the CSE so that we as a committee are in a position to ask questions with all of the documents, not some of the documents, but when we questioned them, we had almost no documents. And so it is necessary that we hear from CSIS and the CSE and that we get the documents. And there's an interesting and frankly troubling parallel between what is happening here and what is happening with respect to the Green Slush Fund documents. Because the government has said, well, we've turned over documents, some are redacted, others are withheld, but just stop the debate in the House shut it down, and turn it over to Proc. And Proc can figure it out. Well, if there's anything that one could have learned from this, is that with this government, the approach that they take is to say to Proc, we're going to thumb our nose at your committee. We'll turn over the documents that we wish to provide. We'll hold back other documents. We'll dump other documents months after they were ordered to turn them over. And we'll do it just as you're about to. We will hold back documents even though you're about to shut down your study, thinking that you had all of the documents in front of you. I mean, it's one big game. It's one big charade with this government. And they have demonstrated that they can't be trusted, that they have no interest in working to be transparent. And so it is why, based on what we have seen with this study, why Conservatives are not going to relent in the House until this government stops thumbing its nose at Parliament and turns over all of the documents related to the Green Slush Fund on an unredacted basis to the law clerk, so that the law clerk can then turn those documents over to the RCMP, so that the RCMP can take whatever steps they may wish to take in relation to a scandal involving $400 million taxpayer dollars, including $330 million taxpayer dollars that involved conflicts of interest amongst board members. 186 conflicts of interest, 186 conflicts of interest identified by the Auditor General. But it's what we have seen in terms of the government's obstruction is that what we've seen in terms of this government's obstruction is part of a pattern of how they have shown time and again disrespect to Parliament. I mean, we can think back to the Winnipeg Lab Scandal, which involved a significant national security breach. And they were ordered, the government was ordered by Parliament to turn over the documents pertaining to the Winnipeg Lab. And the government refused to do so. That resulted in another prima facie question of privilege as determined by the Speaker of the House. Isn't it part of a pattern, all of these questions of privilege relating to refusal of this government to turn over documents? And what did the Liberals do? What did the Prime Minister do? Well, he took the Speaker of the House, the member for Nipissing to Miskaming.
You have to say that to get it on the record because you have the floor.
Okay, colleagues.
We do not consent to adjourn.
Well, colleagues, I'm going to read the standing order here, okay? And in the standing order 710, the committee chair cannot adjourn the meeting without the consent of a majority of members unless the chair decides that a case of disorder or misconduct is so serious as to prevent the committee from continuing its work. I don't know if I have the majority of committee members consenting to adjourn. So I'm looking around the table to see if I have I've read the standing order verbatim. So do I have, I'm looking to this side, I'm looking to the NDP, Madame Gaudreau. Okay. I don't have unanimous consent from the Conservatives, but I have consent of the majority of committee. So the meeting is adjourned.
That way, point of order doesn't